camera, you're welcome to do that, of course. And if you don't know, we are, I think, the oldest seminary in the country, the oldest interfaith seminary in the country. And our endorsement is recognized, as many of you know, by the Association of Professional Chaplains, the Department of Defense, the Veterans Association, and therefore qualifies our ordinands, as you will hear about, to become board certified chaplains. And we also have a spiritual direction program, which is for many students integrated with the chaplaincy program. You can do both of those programs at once for just a little bit more work than doing just the chaplaincy program. And we are a strong community as well as an educational institution. And events like this, where we see our graduates from as far back as 2002 all the way to, what was that, 2 weeks ago, Will? Not very long ago. It's such a beautiful gathering to come together, and we continue to develop more gatherings. Now that we're mostly a remote seminary, these online formats are where we really come together to share ideas, information. In many ways, we share really deeply in some of our formats. So welcome to the community of the Chaplaincy Institute, as well as the academic institution. So we are going to be hearing from Andrew Gregg, and I don't know if there's much that we need to introduce for you, Andrew. Andrew went through our chaplaincy program, was ordained quite recently, currently lives in Vermont, although were you somewhere, and then you were in Montana, and then you've been all over it since I've known you. But I think I'd like to just turn it over to you for the moment and let you jump in and talk about how to become a professional chaplain, the pathway for that.
Yeah, thank you everyone for spending, I guess for those of us on the East Coast, your evening listening to me for a bit. When I sat down to sort of make points and to reflect on the process, for me, I thought it was like this action-packed movie, and it's much more of just a process. It was for me, a long 10-year process of getting to the point of becoming a staff chaplain. And it started professionally or with the accreditation process and getting those credentials ready in 2012. So it's been 10 years for me of starting an undergraduate degree and then landing professionally in a hospital, which for some of you will be very familiar with, and for others, please don't be dismayed, because it is an exciting and viscous experience. Hillary, I think you mentioned being wishful, thinking this was a wishful thing. And I know for me, for a long time, it was as well. But looking back and reflecting on this, I realized, going back to the Civil War, there were chaplains in my family serving in those positions. And so I did sort of have a bedrock for several generations of people in my family, demonstrating, being of service to the community spiritually in ways that I probably ignored for a long time. So that laid a good bit of root for me. And then also I spent a lot of time in hospitals and nursing homes growing up. There were a lot of sick people in my family. And so my parents really embraced showing me and my sister, all of the different aspects of life of what happened in hospitals and what happens when you're sick. So, as I became a person, I was pretty in tune with just sort of the process of life and death, and that being kind of normalized for me. And I also grew up in a place where we have tornadoes. I grew up in Texas, right? So we have floods, we have tornadoes. And so we were often reaching out and helping people who we didn't really know, but who had experienced these things that we had sort of been just saved from, regardless of their relationship to us. So I did have somewhat of a good framework. I just couldn't adapt it very well. I had been encouraged when I was in high school and in early college to go into some sort of ministry, but I grew up gay in Texas in the early 2000s. And so there weren't a lot of examples of how to do that or what that would look like outside of congregational ministry. And I knew that I didn't want to do that. I knew that I didn't want to be attached to sort of a self-selecting group of people, of course, until I found my ChI community. And I was like, these are my people. And I do select them, of course. But I think the first big step that I ever took towards doing this, and it's also an accreditation step, is I switched from being a poli-sci major to being a Jewish studies major, which was a big deal. And my poli-sci advisor was very upset, and she called me over the summer to ask me not to do that. But I knew, to be honest with myself academically, but also as a soul, that I needed to be more theologically inclined. And I think for those of us who have chosen a theological education, it does sort of open up ways of being in the world that are very different, but it also professionally limits us in what we can do in a great way, but also, I had less possibility of doing something more profitable poli-sci wise when I switched to Jewish studies. And so after that, I immediately went into divinity school. But for academic purposes, I still wasn't really ready to accept a direct call into ministry. But when I was in divinity school, what I did meet were other LGBT and adjacent folks who were pursuing ministry, who weren't these sort of perfect examples or martyrs or saints necessarily. They were just regular folks who were interested in, serving the divine in the ways in which they were called. And that's where I first heard about CPE. And I had a roommate, and their partner would come home every night and discuss all of these things about being in the hospital. And I was fascinated by it, and I was transfixed by it, but it wasn't part of my program because I was doing the academic thing and not the spiritual or religious thing, which I think probably a lot of us can identify with. But I had taken a lot of medical sociology courses and was very interested in how culture and science sort of mitigate the ways in which we interact with our bodies, interact with science. And so I graduated divinity school and didn't go to the Chaplaincy Institute. I went to a different university to become a medical sociologist, where I quickly discovered that I loved the clinical setting and I loved interacting with people in hospitals, but I wasn't interested in quantifying misery. I wasn't interested in taking notes on it. And then proposing grand schemes and, revolutions to prevent it. I was, drawn to just being with someone in a moment of fracture and just being present and helping, through witness and divine spirit of sort of doing what I could to make whole what was going on for them. And so I moved back to California, and I spent a lot of time in the Mojave Desert, just sort of trying to listen and to hear what I was supposed to do next. And at the same time, there were a lot of deaths in my family. My grandparents started dying pretty rapidly, and I found myself isolated and alone with these weird degrees in religion and sort of this lifelong search for how to become more directly involved spiritually. And so I started watching documentaries about death in hospitals. And so one of them was about the Zen hospice in San Francisco. Another few were about a hospital in Canada that focused on this one chaplain and nun who just went around in a cancer ward to help accompany people as they cross that final threshold. And so I started Googling, how do I do this? How can I do this? Is it possible for me? And I discovered it was. Luckily, I had those degrees in religion and theology, but I realized I needed one more year, and I needed a group of people who would endorse me, who would help be involved in my formation. And I found this place called the Chaplaincy Institute. And so I sent out some information, and I talked to Katrina, and I can still vividly remember it because I had to pull over in Los Angeles, and I was in a strip center parking lot. And if you're familiar with Southern California, you can probably see it very profoundly, and had to really make a decision to say yes to this calling and yes to what I knew would be difficult work and would be hard work, but also knew how much of what the Chaplaincy Institute does and did at that time as well align so much with the professional standards and competencies of APC and BCC, which are sort of the big credentialing groups for professional chaplaincy. And, I just requested my transcript from Katrina, going through and writing those competencies and equivalencies. It really is amazing how many of the courses that we take and are offered really do just hit line for line those competencies that they deem necessary, and that I know through my own participation in direct patient care are necessary to providing good quality spiritual care. And so I started, making those drives from LA to Berkeley every month. It was expensive. It cut time out of being in relationship with other people, but it was really necessary. And then COVID happened, and a lot of my process in becoming a professional chaplain does involve COVID, because one of the big risks that we all take in moving forward to, at least in clinical chaplains or providing care in clinical settings, is we do all this education, we get these endorsements, and then you have to go in the hospital and do the work. And it's very different, no matter how well prepared we are, once we get into the hospital, and no matter how well supported we were in our education or by our communities, once you step into the hospital, you have to do the thing. And the thing is difficult, and the hospital is a difficult place to be for most people. And then COVID happened, and I found myself without a CPE program. I found, my seminary, my community transitioning from in-person, sitting in circle and sitting in council, to being in this new council that we're in now, being in Zoom, and listening to my academic advisor, who I think quite a few of you are familiar with, but her just saying, you've said yes so many times up to this point. You've been vulnerable so often up to this point. You have to continue to do that. And so I found a tiny hospital in Montana as a critical access hospital in pre-vaccine COVID. And they said, if you want to come here and do this thing, we would be happy to have you come and do it. And so I crossed that threshold and got into the hospital, and pretty quickly realized that it had not been a poor investment, it had been a great investment, and that the investment that I had received along the way from several folks who are here present, and so many people in the Chaplains Institute had served me so well to meet people vulnerably and humbly where they were, and to be able to assess specifically what was their spiritual need, but also to demonstrate, in charting and in accreditation papers with CPE, what I could do to intervene to meet the need, while also recognizing we can't always do everything we want to with our patients, right? We can only take people so far in this process. And so I completed my first unit of CPE. We had the vaccine just by then, and then I was ordained, and then I had to find a residency program, because part of becoming a professional chaplain is you need 4 full units of CPE. And so I had one, and my advisor from CPE said, you need to find the biggest hospital you possibly can to get sucked into. And so I found the Mayo Clinic, which is kind of the biggest hospital one can get sucked into. I got sucked in there, and they really put me through the ringer. And that's what I wanted. I wanted a place that would challenge me professionally as much as she had challenged me as a seminarian, as an ordinand, as someone who answered the call and had accepted the call, and to mesh on a professional level. And I discovered very quickly that I liked trauma, and I liked the emergency department. And in a lot of ways, I liked the intensity of COVID, because it gave you an opportunity to really help people complete the death process in a hasty and an unforgiving manner. And it also very quickly helped me to develop spiritual hygiene and practices to where I could leave the hospital at the end of the day and participate in vibrant life with my ChI community, romantic partners, outdoors, in all of these ways in which you can't participate if you can't let go of the souls that you're assisting in the hospital. And that was a big challenge for me in the beginning, until I realized in order to thrive, in order to provide good care, but also to live rightly outside of the hospital, I needed to come up with ways of getting rid of all of that residue when I left. And we can talk about that in questions if people are interested. The other thing that was also kind of difficult that occurred is, when you're in spiritual direction or you're in congregational ministry, those are sort of self-selecting relationships, right? 2 people meet, and then they decide if they're going to dance. In the hospital, you meet and you dance, right? So you don't have a lot of choice in who you're serving a lot of time. You're the chaplain, something has happened, and it either can't be medically fixed or it can be, but there's still something going on existentially that needs to be addressed. And you're going to address it for no other reason than this person belongs to your hospital district. And one of the big lessons, and it's also a professional lesson, I think for all of us who do work in the hospital, is learning how to serve people we would not seat at our dining room tables, that we don't pray like, that we don't vote like. There were several times, where you would go from one room dealing with someone who didn't believe in the disease that they had, and then go into the next room with someone who believed that they were, politically immune from receiving the same disease, and having to show up vulnerable and soul forward to match what ailed the individual without having to engage with the parts that would prevent the care and also wouldn't lead to fruitful conversation either. And that was a big lesson for me in that residency of how do you serve those who do not like you and who you may not also like, but are part of this divine human tapestry that we're called to serve. And that was a huge, big lesson for me in that process. And it's a difficult one, and one I think a lot of us still struggle with. So I completed residency, and I think the other great thing about completing residency and completing CPE, and I think she recognizes this by requiring us to do CPE or some type of supervised ministry of really saying, can you do the work? You can write the papers, but can you do the work in the world in a way in which it benefits others, but also challenges your own limitations? And like I said before, I'm a trauma chaplain. I work in the emergency department, and I cover the COVID unit here at UVM MC Medical Center. When people just have a fever or something very low grade has happened, I do have to constantly remind myself that there's work to be done there, right? That there's just as much work to be done in the splinter as there is the fracture of someone. And there was this great line that a mentor of mine had and said, there are worse things than the diseases portrayed on the Hallmark Channel, these things which we sympathize with the most. There are these very small things that can happen to someone that open up these spiritual wounds that we're available as chaplains to come in and hold for them and massage if they'll let us, and to strengthen. So when they leave the bed, even if they're not medically healed, or they're healed but not restored to where they once were, they do have a different sense of wholeness that was going to carry them through to whatever they're going to face next. And for me, as a professional chaplain, that's one of those things that I think is important, and that I have to constantly remind myself is, as much as I like trauma and we all have our sort of specialty or niche groups of patients, all patients are deserving of care. And if we're practicing humbly and we're practicing earnestly and vulnerably, we can do that work well, knowing that we could fail at it, knowing that we can get kicked out of the room, but knowing that we have the tools to address it, and that the person in the bed or in the chair, wherever they are that we encounter them, deserves to have someone charged by the divine to meet them where they are. When I left, my residency was over. I was desperately trying to figure out, okay, what do I do next, right? I knew I had to write all these papers for board certification. I knew I had to send out these packets. I know someone else in the room is just did that, which was so inspiring for me to see. I was like, yes, more ChI folks in this great and powerful profession. But of how do you find a hospital or a clinical setting that matches both your skills, but also matches the vows that we take as ChI ordinands? My charge giver charged me with, I was really into the idea of spiritual circuits. And so she told me it was my job to connect these circuits, right? To help people connect their broken circuits back to the divine and their healing processes. And so I applied everywhere that I possibly could. One, because chaplain jobs are hard to find. They're there, but they do require a lot of search. And I am privileged in many ways. And one of the ways in which I am privileged is that I was able to kind of move wherever I wanted to in the country, of it being able to find an opportunity and take it, and to reject other ones that were closer by or closer in your family, or ChI folks, that would have community ready for me, but the opportunity wouldn't have necessarily been there. And that's ultimately how I found the University of Vermont, because they had a position open that let me do my two favorite things, which is to be in the emergency department and to serve on an ethics committee. But it did come with some trade-off, right? It's very expensive to live in Vermont. I don't know anyone in Vermont. And, having to negotiate, how do I use those same tools that I learned of understanding that the hospital is not my entire life, and that part of being professional is going home and creating new and generative ways to be in the community. And a lot of that has been shown to me by people like Andy, people like Katrina, who continue to give service in unique and generative ways that also put forward the cause of producing more chaplains, as we do need. I work in a hospital, we need more and more chaplains, and finding ways to do that. And so I've been able to do that with board service with ChI, but also finding other ways in my current community of knowing that we need interfaith chaplains to participate more broadly in our civic society, because the ways in which we can kind of hold these processes of being a citizen and being on land and being in a political process. And so one of the ways in which I've done that, and which is kind of unique, is joining the board of a park district. I'm, the eco chaplain on the park district, which is also, I see it as part of that professional service to the community, but a way in which is also enriching to me. So it has been 10 years. I started in 2012 when I switched that major from poli-sci to Jewish studies, and then, went to divinity school, got lost for a while in the desert, literally out in the Mojave for a few years, found ChI, and then, really found professional calling through credentialing work during COVID, and was able to find this position as a staff chaplain at a level 1 trauma center, which is not for everyone. It's really not, but it is for me. And I think that's a great part of being engaged in the process with a group like the Chaplaincy Institute, and with our community of folks who will shepherd you in a responsible but tough way to sort of really find what those gifts are and then help you uphold them. And as someone who talks all day and has talked for 10 hours in the hospital already, I would be happy to entertain other people talking and investigating anything that I've said that might be interesting or not so interesting, but anything anyone would like to put forth, I would be happy to engage with.
I have a question. It's more towards Katrina, though. Do you know how many ChI folks are board certified chaplains, have gone all the way through the process?
I don't know. I certainly hear about it and send people those transcripts when they need them, as some of you know. Gosh, if I had to guess off the top of my head, what seems to be a pattern is that people do it like several years after they graduate and are ordained. And in let's say my last 5 years in the office, I think there may have been, I don't know, maybe 10 to 15 folks that I've heard of that have been in that process. So that's a very rough approximation of even the last 5 years. But if I had to guess off the top of my head, I'd say, like, completely randomly, maybe 25 to 30% because we also have so many chaplains. I mean, your story, Andrew, is a wonderful description, and thank you so much, by the way. And I love your sort of combining of the personal details as well as the sort of professional details. Like, I love that combination. But there are lots of people that come through the program who go on to do chaplaincy work in healthcare, hospice, or hospitals, who don't even have a master's degree and don't get board certified. So that's not typical, but I know there is also that. So that kind of skews the data, I think.
And it's not uncommon for people to wait several years towards board certification, just because there are additional, I think it's at least 2,500 documented hours of professional work in the hospital that you need. So, and a lot of hospitals will give you 3 to 5 years, to put forth that process. So it's really not that unusual for folks to kind of give themselves a lot of space to sort of gain that experience and demonstrate in their writing that they can be certified.
So if I can ask you a question, Andrew, or maybe you, Jen, whomever knows this. So what you're saying, if I understand correctly, is that you can be hired as a chaplain in a hospital, but not yet board certified, but you're underway in that process, but it might take many years of work because of those accumulating hours, but they hire you with the understanding that you're on the way to being board certified?
In my experience, usually they're willing to hire you if you sort of meet the standards of board certification and would like to. That's not all places, but most of the places I applied to, as long as you kind of met, you could check all the boxes, but just sort of needed to send off the envelope at some point. They were willing to give you the interview and to interact with you in that way.
So those, in case those of you may not know what those points are, ordained by a recognized organization like the Chaplaincy Institute, the full year of CPE is probably one of those also, and then a master's degree, which for many of you, it's maybe a master's of divinity, but I've heard that I know that they're also taking like a master's of social work or counseling degrees at this point also, but those three items probably, right?
Yeah, and they are pretty broad with what they'll accept for that master's, right? Like I don't have a master's in divinity, I have a master's of religion, but because of where the equivalencies kind of fall through, it works. And they're also willing to assign you a mentor to kind of walk you through that application process as well. So you're not totally on your own.
Oh, nice.
So there's a little bit different answer to that first question, Katrina. Here in California, things are really competitive. And so the standard requirement is that you're board certified or you're board certified eligible within 18 months to 2 years. And it's 2,000 hours, not 2,500, 2,000 clinical hours that you have to have documented and signed off on and have a letter sent to the powers that be. But yeah, it's a big game of ping pong. That's what it felt like. You know, you go to ChI and then you have to do CPE, but you have to do CPE to get ordained, right? But then you need to have 4 units of CPE to become board certified, and the Masters of Divinity, which then was broadened while I started the Masters of Divinity program in 2019. I think in 2020, they expanded that to accept any master's that was sort of relatable or related as far as a DMin or master's in theology, these things. Then they dropped the requirement of ordination. So you don't need to be ordained now. Because if you have a master's of social work and you're not really quite in the theology track, you might not be working towards ordination, but you can still be a chaplain. All of that said, hospice is the entry level into becoming a chaplain without all of these other requirements. And hospice, because that's a very competitive, also really quickly growing field. A lot of home health care businesses that are looking to expand into hospice will take on chaplains with 1 unit of CPE and don't specify much beyond that. And so you have to kind of do background checking on the hospice itself, because if they don't know what they're asking for, they may not value their chaplains. So it goes both ways.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you're so right, California, there are different parts of the country that it's much more competitive, and what they would like you to hit coming in, a lot of times is pretty unrealistic. If you're just getting out of school, if you're just getting out of credentialing, it's very difficult. And California is one of those, Georgia is one of those, Texas is one of those. And you have those really large states which have huge healthcare systems. It's so competitive that it can be almost discouraging. But if you hang in there long enough and you're dedicated to the work long enough, there definitely are opportunities. You know, I started in California, as Katrina said, when I was in Montana. Now I'm in Vermont. I had to go through all of the time zones to sort of complete the process, which for me, it was worth it, and it worked out. But it is, you know, it takes a lot of tenacity to stick it through.
I have something to add to that. When you say professional chaplain, means you're being paid as chaplain.
Mhm.
And the places where people actually pay you are still very narrow, means you got to be either hospital or hospice, or perhaps prison. And beyond that, it's very tough to have someone who's building it as a career to say, I need to make a living doing this. Then you had to do a little this, little that, little this, little that, which is, for some of us, is actually fine. You know, you may not want to be full-time anywhere. But I'm noticing that, for instance, I would love to do work in very non-traditional fashion. I could do that. I could try to get in to be a volunteer, but try to say I like to get paid, that's a whole different story. So, you know, like you, I don't want to be a congregational minister. I mean, I could finish Star King and be a UU minister, but that's another 2 more years, which don't want to do that. So I'm continue to be in the wilderness to discover where I belong, right? And it's actually quite interesting process. So it's not like I'm looking, it's like I'm open to see what's looking for me. You know, what's the work to do? And sometimes that just show up. You need to just be very open for it. You know, so yes, in a larger metropolitan area, they have a lot more requirement. You know, you can't even go to hospice anymore. The hospice also require the same thing. But if you go to a small hospital, you know, my friend Sally did the whole chaplaincy. She's been a chaplain for a small hospital, and she doesn't have MDiv. And she just finished, she's my classmate, she just finished being ordained, which is sort of going backwards. But she had all kind of practical experience, which is fascinating. And you find a lot people in ChI is like that. They kind of put their lives together in interesting way. By the way, I have an MDiv equivalency because I have an MCC. Okay, it means I'm a marriage counseling psychology. So they accepted that, but they want 72 units. So you add other things on it. I come from a Buddha school, so I add those credit into it. So it's negotiated. You know, so now you have an MDiv equivalent. So you actually go to the hospital, say, hey, I need 1 year I need 3 more units. I could do that. So, but I'm not there yet. I'm not going there yet. So, yeah.
And per diem is also an interesting way of sort of accumulating some of that experience and also being paid, giving you different amounts of time for other stuff in your life as well. And I agree, there's so much opportunity, I think, in suburban and rural areas. And that's what happened with me with CPE during COVID. I just started calling hospitals and asking, you know, if they would take me and be a part of this hybrid program. And I think I called almost 20 and one of them said yes, right? And so if you're willing to find those opportunities, and it's hard, they're there. But it is difficult, and I agree. People come at this in all different angles, and there's no specific timeline sort of to meeting those requirements for board certification. And I think in a lot of ways, unfortunately, it is sort of designed for people who start at 18, you know, complete 4 years of schooling, are able to do somehow massively put together 8 years of, you know, perfect requirement meeting by the time they're 26. I don't think that's realistic for most of us who, you know, function on spiritual or theological time. We're usually busy doing other things and finding ourselves and finding the divine in ways that are interesting. And so a lot of times
I don't know about you.
Yeah.
When I was 24, I don't think I even have enough experience of life. So I had no way of accompanying anybody. You know what I mean? So
yeah.
You had to live a life in order to be, how do you say, having any sense of what that journey looks like, for me anyway. So
I was waiting tables and tending bar. I was not in the position necessarily to be at the bedside at that point. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because the average age of our students is about 50. So people are really called to chaplaincy. And actually, this is reminding me, Andrew, of something that I noticed you say that I so often hear of like what I term resisting the call. Like, well, I kind of wanted to do this. I kind of like avoided it for years. And then finally, and I can't tell you how many times I hear that, like, oh, I've thought about this for 20 years. I thought about this for 5 years, maybe even, but, and we get people later, like I think when they have gone through life experience and they have gone through like poli-sci and medical anthropology or whatever you said, like all these other things that are related, but not actually the thing itself that they're kind of called to do. And then, you know, I mean, I'm looking at Celia, and, you know, Celia is a great example of somebody who's called, and to use that word, and motivated to come to seminary, clearly belongs here and doesn't quite yet know exactly how it's going to manifest, because that happens too. There's a lot of that also, people who are really excited to be here. I mean, I just admitted someone to the program today who says, I know I want to be there. I'm called to go to seminary. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. Great, come on in. So it's there's a lot of different things about time and age, and yeah. So what other questions does anybody have while you have a handful of professional chaplains here in the room? Yeah, Casey, jump in.
Yeah, well, thank you, everybody. Interesting conversation. And thank you, Andrew. I really loved hearing your story, the personal and the professional woven together. And I think you mentioned at one point about spiritual hygiene and what you do to help take care of yourself and make the transition from work to yourself. So I would love to hear more about that if you'd like to share.
Yeah, and so it's going to be different for different folks. For me, it was always about being deeply connected to nature. I am a Texan. I grew up from a ranching family. We were always outside all of the time, being connected to the earth as much as we were to other people. And it's one of the reasons why I did very well when I lived in California, because I could live in LA, but by an hour and a half, I was in the Mojave, or I was in the mountains, or I was somewhere that was as nourishing as what I was doing professionally, that I was also doing personally and spiritually, and choosing places that had those aspects to them as well. I'm a nomad. I've lived in all the time zones. And so when I was looking for somewhere to do CP residency, you know, Rochester, Minnesota has this massive trail system. So I could leave the hospital and immediately be back into the areas that were most nourishing to me, which is outside. Here in Burlington, half of our space, city space, is open land. It's mountains, it's streams, it's lakefront. And so we have that ready for us. It's also about knowing what your own limit is in the hospital, right? It's not necessarily about seeing every single patient. It's not, for me, having a transformational visit with every single person. It's about knowing that I've done a good job and that there's nothing pulling me magnetically back into the hospital that I should have done. And just by knowing that I have done my work and now I get to go home to doing activities that I enjoy, that are as vibrant and as exciting and nourishing as what's been going on in the hospital. And it's also knowing that I am one person in a giant medical system, and there's only so much that I can do, and there's only so much everyone else can do, and that's enough at the end of the day.
Beautiful, thank you.
And being around lots and lots of people.
Nice.
I have kind of a follow-up on that, or yeah, just following that thread a little bit. You talked about you love trauma and sort of the intensity of that piece of the work. And then you also said not too long after that if it's a splinter, that person also is as deserving of care. And I'm interested in the range there of intensity and how you hold both of those things without, I mean, just I'm thinking of moral injury and like this, you know, a lot of ER nurses I know that have spent their lives in that industry have like, they're the one person I want around when stuff really goes sideways, and they can be kind of brusque and like, oh, suck it up, honey, I've seen so much worse, you know. Can you speak to that showing up with compassion, even if it's something that's not catastrophic.
Yeah. I always think a cactus is a really nice way of thinking about spiritual care, and that you're not going to be able to grab it. You might be able to give it a little water. Like, it needs very specific things to thrive. And so when we encounter people, we know we're not going to be able to do all of the things that we want to with them. Swinging back and forth, there's a trauma chaplain at Rush in Chicago, and she's been there for 25 years. And she talks a lot about when you encounter severe trauma or very small trauma, it's very important to see if care, compassion, and love are being freely exchanged in what's going on. And that as a chaplain responding to those very severe traumas, maybe we get to hop in, but if we can see that care and compassion and love are being circulated within the people responding, just doing that, we're doing our job, right? Of just making sure that those things are happening, we're doing the job. And keeping in mind that knowing you can have someone who is, attempted, to end their life for the 4th or 5th time, and you're not going to be able to reach them, and they don't want to be reached, and that's not going to happen for you. But you can find, an 85-year-old woman who has fallen and has just been lying in the bed, and her hip hasn't been relocated. And all she really needs is for what we would call compassionate touch. She just needs someone to acknowledge her and the pain that she's going through. And I think that so much of chaplaincy is being able to understand that we all experience pain. It is caused by different things, but we feel it in the same way, and that it should be responded to in the same way. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's how I approach it.
And Andrew, you're saying that way reminds me of something that's totally sort of a tangent, but just a point. But one of the things that's so amazing about working at the Chaplaincy Institute is that all of the students, all of the staff, everybody has that orientation of that deep, deep compassion. And it's such a beautiful thing to be in a community of people who really hold that value. And yeah, we're all human. We all have our moments of fallibility, but there's such a beautiful thing about that community of spiritually focused, loving people, actually. So just a tangent there.
I agree. There's really nothing like really being nurtured by a group of people who provide spiritual care, helping you in your formation to go in to do that same kind of work. And when I describe it to other people who've just been to divinity school or just to social work school, it really does blow their minds that the gifts that we're given and earned, right, through the process and through what we have to do to complete the program, it really does shock them, all of what we are given so freely by those who have been given it, so freely, going back and back and back. But it is such a unique and special community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we sometimes forget, because it's so much a core of what our program and our pedagogy is at ChI, like that connection and nurturance and supporting the spiritual formation, as you said, is core to the process of helping people grow into chaplains, as our students do. So I see we just have about a few more minutes, but I'm going to put my contact information in the chat. And I've gotten one message, and Robin, we definitely will connect, but I'm going to put my direct email. It's the admissions. Maybe I should ask you to do this, Andrew. admissions@chaplaincyinstitute.org is how you can reach me directly if you want to set up a time to talk about any of the things that we've touched on today. If you're not already a graduate of ChI, if you're curious to hear more. So what other questions does anybody have for Andrew or any of our other graduates here in the room, or Andrew or I, if that's where you go? Yeah, Casey.
Make a brief comment following the beautiful sharings. I feel, I love, Andrew, what you're saying about the making sure care, compassion, and love are circulating. And I think that's why I'm drawn to ordination, is to make it like I have a stamp of approval to stand for love.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Andrew, I'm wondering if you can be more specific with your personal self-care practices throughout the day. I know connecting to nature is huge. That's huge for me as well. And I go kayaking on the days that I have time to do that. But we in trauma situations need to step back and take a minute of self-care sometimes between patient visits. So I'm wondering what you do during that time.
Yeah, it's one, knowing when to leave the trauma situation, when you've done your assessment, when you have found a point of intervention and you've made your intervention, and that is something that you get through time and practice of doing the work, but of knowing when it's time to leave, and then knowing when it's time to step back in. I take the stairs. I very rarely take the elevator. That's an important thing for me. I also have sort of a personal odometer of the higher the shoulder gets, the more tense I know that I am, and that I need to do something physical with my body to excise that. And that can be going like this. I listen to a lot of disco music in my ears when I'm going up and down the stairs to pop myself out before I can go back into another room and provide additional care to someone else. So for me, it's physical, and it's always been physical. Going back to Montana and running out of the hospital when it's very cold and snowing, and just getting that out and creating more space for myself and for the divine to go back in. Yeah. So run on the stairs, getting out of breath, and listening to bad podcasts sometimes, just garbage that makes me laugh, and I think that's important too.
And what about you, Jen? Do you have practices that are useful for you?
I do similar things. I try to go outside. Our hospitals don't have very, very beautiful outdoor spaces right now. They've been kind of neglected. But I do take stairs also, and or ride the elevator up and down a couple times needlessly, just to get some space to myself and take the long way around. I don't run anywhere. I cover the psych ward. I cover 3 campuses on the weekend by myself in Oakland and Berkeley. So I'm constantly triaging and figuring out who's the trauma that needs me most in at any given moment. And so I figure, unless there's family members, which there haven't been for 2 years, and we're letting them back in now, I don't need to be the first to respond to a code blue. I'm there to support staff in a code blue, but I don't need to be the one hustling. So being very mindful. I know there's a quote somewhere about that contact between the feet and the earth, and being mindful about that contact while you're walking. And just, knowing that being in the middle of chaos is also energizing, and I love it. But I don't like being around a lot of people. When I leave the hospital, I like quiet time. I like being outside by myself. I go to the local lake here to kayak, but I will go at 7 a.m. because everybody shows up by 10 to go fishing, and then it's too crowded for me, right? So it's really understanding ourselves and what those needs are,
Right.
as far as being around people and tucking back out and taking time for ourselves.
Thanks, Jen. I want to see what Hillary would like to contribute, question or comment. I think you're muted, maybe. You're still muted. Maybe you can't get unmuted.
Yeah, I just did it. Okay, so can people hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, thanks very much. This has been really enriching. It's also been very touching. I do feel, a certain calling or being led. I'm just not giving up, obviously. I've been involved, I'm not letting go, but I just feel pretty hopeless about the possibility of ever really launching, a new career. And I've heard a lot of things which were a little bit confusing. To me, I have been talking to somebody at the Sutter hospital, and they do the CPE units there. And he was telling me that I don't even get a look in unless I have a bachelor's, which I don't. And so, I'm just wondering, even if I were able to get myself into a financial situation where I could afford to come to ChI, I have no bachelor's, I have no master's, certainly not. So I don't, and I'm 60, whatever I am, 3, I believe. So it all seems a little daunting to actually, and I know people have started, my age or even later, but, maybe they do have the paper qualifications in order to do so, and the money to do so. It's just the huge question is, do I save what little money I've got to live on for the rest of my life? Or do I spend, because it's a big amount of money, do I spend that and more, in the hope that I can somehow or other, earn a living through doing it? And then I'm hearing how hard it is to do that, especially in California. And I don't have the MDiv or any of, the masters or the bachelors. And the guy in Sutter, he really said, he really just went, no, if you don't have a bachelor's or a master's, forget a career in chaplaincy. Forget it. Is pretty much what he was.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah,
Please.
I did everything upside down and backwards, absolutely upside down and backwards. I started ChI without a bachelor's, with 1 year of formal college under my belt and 4 children. And I came out of ChI with the courage and the will to apply anyway, despite all of the expectations written down for CPE, the expectations written down, qualifications you needed to have for Sutter. I'm with Sutter now. I was hired 2 months into the Masters of Divinity program after having done 2 years of hospice without having graduated from anything. Well, I graduated from ChI, but ChI was not accredited at that time, and I was not enrolled in Star King. And so on its own, it was like this floating island of qualifications that had yet to be accepted anywhere for where I was thinking I wanted to go. I went into ChI thinking I was never going to go for a Master's of Divinity. There was no way. I had 1 year of college. I didn't want to do 3 more years of college. So I applied to a graduate program and got in. So now I have 2 master's degrees as of May.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so it's one of those things that you just got to see the next step. You don't got to see the top of the staircase right now. Just follow your heart into it and apply anyway, even if you don't have the qualifications, and then talk to the people, talk to them, because surely you've got a lot of life experience that has led you here. You are called to be of service somehow, and way will open for you. It will. It always does. When you need to be of service in the world, you'll find a way.
thank you.
I love that. And I have to say, I mean, Jen, that was just amazing. And Jen is not the only one. I can think of 2 students off the top of my head who, well, one of them may have a bachelor's degree, but was just hired. He isn't even ordained yet, but he was just hired in a hospital as a chaplain, and he's still a student at the Chaplaincy Institute, but he's got a job as a chaplain now, and he hasn't done a master's degree at all. He's in Michigan. And then I can think of another student who didn't have any college experience, who went on and did a full year residency, which they pay you for, by the way. And then she got hired in a hospice organization. She has no college experience at all. So there are, as Jen was saying, there are pathways that are not the typical ones, and there may not be the ones that everybody tells you about, but we see them frequently in the people that come through the doors and then leave ChI and go somewhere and keep going. So,
Thank
and
you.
I'm aware that we're 5 minutes over our scheduled time. So we don't have to cut this short if somebody has more questions, but if you need to leave, please do take care of yourself and leave if you need to.
Yeah, I do. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much.
Good to
Thank you.
see you, Hillary.
Thank you. Good to
Yeah,
see you.
call me if you have more questions. We'll talk about it later.
Yes, I'd like to. Thank you very much.
Great. Anyone else have any questions or comments they want to share? Well, I wish you could have recorded what you just said, Jen, because that was such a beautiful, like inspirational, like play this every morning. You know, don't get discouraged, just do it. So thank you for that. And I'm delighted to hear you have 2 master's degrees now. That's so cool. So we've come to the end of our scheduled time. And Gregg, thank you, Andrew. I've always done that with you. I always call you Gregg. It's so funny. Andrew, thank you so much for sharing. And thank you to everybody else who has shared as well, contributing your experience, your wisdom to this conversation. And thank you to every single one of you for being drawn to spiritual care, however you're doing it, however you've already done it, whether you're a chaplain or whether you're just curious, there's some way in which I'm sure you are serving the world. And thank you for that, because it's all about expanding that love in the world. And we do get to do that when we're called to this kind of work. So thank you for doing that. And if you'd like to get in touch, I posted my email address, and I can also post my phone number. My work number is 510-295-0493 is in the chat. Call me directly if you have any questions or you just want to chat about this whole chaplaincy thing. And the ChI Talks happen on the 3rd Tuesday of every month, unless it's a holiday or something like that. So keep coming back, watch our newsletter. We're here, and it's so good to have you all here. Any last